Hello everybody, welcome to this CIEEM webinar on district level licensing for Great Crested Newts scheme improvements. This webinar will be presented by Craig Thomas, who's with us here from Natural England, and Alex Jackson, who will hopefully be joining us shortly. We will be doing a Q&A session, so please do pop your questions in the Q&A box on your toolbar, and we'll look to answer these at the end of the webinar. So yeah, without further ado, I will hand over to Craig to present the webinar. Thank you, Craig. Thank you,
Christy. All right, an introduction to myself. I've been working on, I'm now one of the managers on DLL. I've been working on the scheme for 4 years, since its inception. And I will be joined by Alex, who's one of our GCN strategists later. And he's going to focus on particular types of development that we're bringing into DLL that require some bespoke methodologies. So without further ado, so what I'm going to run through today is an introduction to DLL at a high level. Whenever we've done these in the past, we've often wrongly, I think, assumed a certain level of knowledge. And we're kind of learning from our mistakes. So we're going to try and talk you through how DLL works at a relatively high level, but also what that has meant in terms of learning and how we've adjusted our thinking around DLL accordingly. I'll talk about the timeline for DLL, so what the last 4 years have looked like. And then we're going to focus on data and modeling, how that works, but in particular, how we're adjusting thinking in light of learned knowledge. Habitat delivery, what's changing about that. We'll focus on the developer's customer journey. Apologies for that horrible term, but we all need to know how it looks in terms of from a developer's perspective. And then Alex will walk us through the following development types: phase developments, temporary impacts, and linear schemes. And as Christy said, we'll have plenty of time for questions at the end. Yeah, pictures of Great Crested Newts there. I'm confident that they're just friends in the top right-hand corner, but what do I know? Okay, so an introduction to DLL. Clearly, we look at the impact of a development using our impact assessment tool. So impacts are based on an assessment of the impact on a scheme in any given area, which may or may not require so be based on survey information. So we can use risk zone models or survey information where available. And I'll talk about the risk zone models in a minute in particular. Survey information where it is available, and probably less than 50% of the time it's available. It's certainly not required, but it may be available. We do require that if it is available and ask for it. And we use that information to base a judgment on the impact of a development. But like I say, most of the time we use our models. Developers then pay a conservation payment, which is based upon that impact on the species. It's important to say that impacts to ponds outside development sites are considered within 250 metres of the site boundary. And we judge that on the proportion of terrestrial habitat impacted within the red line boundary of the development site. We work with habitat delivery bodies, HDBs. They deliver and maintain and monitor off-site compensatory habitat. We'll talk through that in more detail. One of the rules, one of the absolute givens to DLL is that for every occupied pond that might be lost, we ensure 4 ponds minimum are created and restored ahead of the impact. It's upfront habitat delivery. And where we stand at the moment, DLL schemes are available in 155 LPAs in the country, as detailed on the map to the right. Natural England delivers the majority of these schemes, The Nature Space Partnership delivers several, and in Dorset and in Telford and Woking, the LPA runs a version of DLL. But the vast majority, about 80%, are run by Natural England. And there is the hope that some of the gaps in the map to the right will be filled in, and DLL will be available in the near future in the majority of those. So where we've got to today over the last 4 years, very quickly, probably started in spring 2016, looking at whether we can use the 4 new policies to permit licensing change to benefit European protected species, which obviously GCN are one of the first. That enables off-site compensation and the whole scheme approach, really. And the forerunner to where we are now came in Woking, where the Borough Council ran a pilot. Money was secured from MHCLG. A significant amount of that money was used to survey across England. So we did a large survey, the largest ever, over 3 seasons, doing eDNA survey of ponds. Again, I'll touch on that in more detail in a minute. The first scheme to be licensed was the Nature Space Partnership in the South Midlands in 2018, and Natural England launched schemes in Kent and Cheshire in early 2019. Great many schemes have been run and launched since. Essex, Wiltshire, Shropshire, Greater Manchester, and then a whole slew of schemes now live within the last 12 months to ensure that DLL is operational in 155 LPA areas. So that's really the background. How does that work in practice? We look at developing species distribution models for each strategy area. And strategies generally are at a county type scale. They're clusters of LPAs within a county. So there's a scheme operational in Cheshire, in Kent, in Essex. That's the sort of level we're looking at developing species distribution models. And they're based on the survey data that I mentioned earlier, the eDNA survey data. What we generally do is about 300 ponds are selected that are representative of the landscape types present in any given area. So not necessarily the same landscapes are obviously present in Essex as in Cheshire, as in Yorkshire. So we tailor ponds that are representative of all the types and then randomly select them to do eDNA survey, roughly 300 per survey area. On top of that, we layer in biological records, class license returns, and critically, stakeholder feedback determines where the amount of information, the modeling. And again, I'll touch on that later. There's a whole host of variables that fed into the model, and this number's expanded recently. So there are key core habitat variables such as arable grassland density, distance to woodland, pond density, distance to rivers, soil pH and drainage. So those are the key variables fed into the model. Pond density and soil, critically important. Each of those fed in with the eDNA survey to produce the models that we've got for each scheme area. When we started, we were looking at producing a series of regional models, as I've just described, 1 per scheme area. But we did look initially at whether we needed a whole single model for England. We decided to look at the series of regional models, and that's definitely been vindicated. One of the key lessons learned is how different GCM behave in different parts of the country. So in Lancashire, for example, 13% of ponds are occupied on average, 47% occupancy in Essex. So suitable ponds in suitable habitat have completely different occupancy levels and rates in different areas of the country. That's not particularly surprising when you think about it. The key variables that we think are in play here are soil type and climate. The climate, as you go north, is not as suitable for the species, and the occupancy levels decline. And as a consequence, trying to define and develop a single national model will have proved impossible. So the regional approach, bespoke to a county, is definitely more accurate in predicting the presence or absence of GCN. That said, we are now using the regional scheme models we've developed to extrapolate and produce a England-wide model, one for the whole country that can be layered behind all of the regional models. I'll explain why that's important later. And as I've just mentioned, the two critical factors that are determining the variation that we see seems to be soil properties, in particular the pH and the drainage of those soils, and climate. So we see an absence of GCN in the southwest. There's fewer suitable ponds for GCN in Cornwall and Devon, but they're still largely absent. Why is that? We think critically the climate is at play. Why is that important? Because we want to accommodate as many schemes as possible into DLL. From an ecologist perspective, that's because we believe that DLL provides better outcomes for the species. So we want to be able to offer DLL as an alternative to traditional mitigation licensing in as many places as possible. So we're looking at bringing in linear schemes into DLL. Now, the difficulty of that is that a linear scheme, particularly a large one, will cross several regions. As we've just identified, each region's model will be different, subtly different to its neighbouring one, and potentially quite significantly different at opposite ends of the country. So we're using the idea of the England model overlaid on the regional models to get the most accurate prediction of GCM presence alongside linear schemes. We're looking at something called white zones, which we'll touch on again later, to overlay that model, to make linear scheme modelling as accurate as it can be and make a true representation and assessment of the impact on the species. Computer models are very good. We're confident that they're more than 95% accurate, but you can't beat stakeholder feedback. And that's a critical facet of DLL, and something that's become increasingly important over the last 4 years is to test the modelling that we've developed with people on the ground. It was recognised very early on in the Natural England model that organisations closer to the species in each region, we need as much information from them to shape the project with them to make DLL as accurate as it can be. In particular, the mapping and the modelling, because of this regional bias and importance. So all of our modelling is shared with stakeholders, local record centres, groups, wildlife trusts, WAGs, ARG, and all that information is fed into the model to make it as accurate as it can be. And that local stakeholder and steering group input is a critical facet of all levels of the Natural England scheme, through modelling, through habitat delivery, as we'll see in a minute, through to running live schemes. And in the modelling in particular, and in habitat delivery, we reference the work. I want to reference the work of the expert panel. So this is an independent panel that was set up, which includes esteemed members like Professor Richard Griffiths of the University of Kent, Dr. Silviu Petrovan from the University of Cambridge, Jim Foster from ART, and various representatives from the LPAs and ecological consultants. And they've tested, provided challenge and support at all stages of the development of DLL that we see today. where we set off from 4 years ago and where we are now has changed quite dramatically in certain areas. That's as a result of increased knowledge of how the species reacts to its circumstances, local circumstances. And we refine the modelling, and we refine the habitat delivery, the pond specification in light of the expert panel feedback. So the scheme has continually evolved over the last 4 years. A key part of habitat delivery, what we call the strategic opportunity area maps. Clearly, with DLL, we're looking at producing compensatory habitat in strategic locations that are going to be secure for 25 years, our definition of in perpetuity. What that means is we produce these maps that define core habitat variables that are suitable for ponds and suitable for the species. It looks at drainage, but it also looks at pond density and the terrestrial habitat around those ponds. So you can have ponds, but if the terrestrial habitat's not there, GCM will be absent. So this is where the strategic opportunity area maps come in. We also layer in development plans from local authorities, and they determine what the SOA map looks like. So we strip out any areas that may be subject to development in the next 10, 15 years and beyond. So this is a map of Yorkshire, and it shows the core and the fringe areas of SOA. And we said before, the core areas are where if you put ponds in there, you're going to be increasing population. And in fringe areas, you're going to be allowing the species to move through the landscape. So it's important that you get a mix of both habitat delivery in core and fringe SOA areas. And how they're ranked is the combinations of habitat types present in any given location. So where arable is present, you get a negative variable. Where grassland and woodland are present, you get a positive. And you put in all of those variables into the model, and it comes up with this map. And the greater the number of positive attributes, and that determines where the core SOA areas are. So I mentioned earlier habitat delivery bodies. These are the organisations that Natural England uses to deliver those compensation ponds within the SOAs. And the vast majority of these are delivered on private land. We started off with one habitat delivery body, usually per scheme area. That's actually changed now. There are often one or two habitat delivery bodies per scheme area. And who they are, the likes of the FWAGs, ecological units within LPAs, and the wildlife trusts. Again, this reflects that the modelling is great, but actually to get a true representation of what's happening and whether locations are suitable, you need people with the local knowledge to test that modelling. So a model may determine that site X is suitable, but until it's visited by people on the ground that have knowledge of local landowners and circumstance, that location may not actually indeed be suitable. So habitat delivery body project officers will visit every site to double check that a proposed location is suitable for a pond. On top of that, a development over the last 18 months has been something we call pond auctions. So the traditional mechanism of delivery is a project officer working within a habitat delivery body, going out to landowners that may be amenable, using those contacts, discussing whether they'd like ponds on their land. And often what happens is those landowners speak to neighbouring landowners and you get a momentum. And in many areas of the country, we actually have a list of landowners wanting ponds, and we're just still, the demand is behind. There's a lag of demand for those ponds. It's a good position to be in. That's not necessarily the case everywhere. And we do have to reflect upon the fact that demand will peak and trough. And it is essential through DLL that we have pond availability at all times. And those ponds are placed in advance of a development so that the pond can mature and be suitable for the species. So we've augmented our traditional delivery with something we're calling pond auctions. And we're working with Entrade, who are a subsidiary of Wessex Water. And over the course of about 18 months of discussion, we've got a working platform with them, which is an online tool, which is advertised. And that allows landowners to understand that, first of all, there's a scheme happening and there's an auction coming up. So all landowners will be communicated generally by email. There may be 2,000, 3,000 landowners contacted in any given area. And what happens is that they can register on the Entrade site and put in their details. It shows them where the SOA maps are, and only those within SOA maps can actually enter the platform and bid. And they can determine whether they want between, say, 2 and 6 ponds, and they can determine a price to do that. And it's actually the landowner themselves that are responsible for the work. However, every site that is chosen has to be verified, and habitat delivery bodies will visit each and every site. So very much the case of the traditional way of working as well. We layer the two systems together. What we're doing is using pond auctions as an engagement tool, and the pricing parameters are very narrow. So we're not really using the auction as a system for determining price. We're actually using the auction as an engagement tool for landowners that otherwise wouldn't be reached by traditional means. So the two systems work really well over the top of each other. The habitat delivery body has to visit every site, discuss with the landowner what's required, walk them through the pond specification. It's been signed off by the expert panel, and then oversee the works to ensure that the ponds are suitable. And as you can see on this slide, a landowner puts in their details, describes how many ponds they want, the unit price. They then deliver those ponds, but the work is overseen by, in this case, FWAG East, one of our delivery partners. And that's really been useful in places like Essex, where there's a lot of newt distribution in Essex. About 47% of ponds are occupied by the species, and there's quite significant development pressure. So pond auctions are a useful tool to ensuring that we always have enough ponds to service supply. Increasingly important are local steering groups. They consist of, as you can see there, habitat delivery bodies, the LPAs, record centres and ARGs, amongst others. And they're really looking at the strategies and ensuring that delivery of habitat is in keeping and reflects the demands of the local strategies. Ever seeking the fact that habitat delivery can actually deliver multifunctional benefits for other species as well. We have 12 steering groups currently active, attended by 113 members, individuals and organisations. And they're helping to steer the direction of project delivery and ensuring that it reflects the strategies we have for each area. Again, can't stress the importance of this. It really is extremely important that we have that local flavour to our delivery. The whole scheme is designed to use modelling, but on top of that, layer in that local level of expertise to ensure we're compliant with strategies. We know what development pressures are likely to be over the next 18 months, 2 years, ensure ponds are in the right areas and spreading the risk across many different landowners. And that's really the job of the steering groups, to get that local flavour. We've launched several strategies recently, so there'll be an additional 5 steering groups set up in the next few months. As you can see, with representation from 113 members, getting a broad level of support from local practitioners. want to touch on dairy pond. I think those of you that were present on the webinar last week will probably mention this species and this pond. So this was delivered by the Norfolk Ponds Project for us. It was a pond restoration. As you can see on the top left there, it was a heavily overgrown pond, very little if no water in it, certainly impossible to maintain a population of GCN. And over the course of 12 to 18 months, it was restored. Scrub was cleared, it was desilted, and it became a very nice pond. Now, clearly that any DLL project is designed to create suitable GCM ponds. But as we're seeing, a great many other taxa are benefiting as a result. Farmland birds in particular are definitely benefiting from creating more ponds. And this pond, we ended up with grass polly re-establishing in Norfolk. Hadn't been seen for over a century. And it clearly, the seeds of grass polly have been dormant in that silt for over 100 years. And it re-established. This is just a fantastic byproduct of the amount of habitat that we're creating as a result of DLL. Our next pond, believe it or not, will be our 1000th pond. So we've delivered 999 ponds up to the end of March 2021. I'll just talk about the customer journey, if I may. Probably many of you are familiar with this. So an applicant makes an inquiry to Natural England, and we use the red line boundary supplied to make an impact assessment. What impact is there going to be on GCN as a result of Development X? And we provide a cost quotation back to the applicant as part of an impact assessment. If accepted by the client, this quotation is signed by them and then signed by Natural England and is used in the planning permission. And if planning permission is then granted, any remaining payment is made to Natural England. A license application is submitted and supplied to allow works to proceed. Now, something that we've developed since we first started is something what we call the first stage payment. And that's required at the certificate stage for larger developments requiring 3 or more ponds. We ask for part payment relating only to the delivery of ponds themselves to cover the cost of delivering ponds, which is £4,200 per pond. We require that up front. And that's securing ponds to ensure that they are allocated developments ahead of planning permission. Most developments don't require such, but the larger developments do. If planning permission is not secured by that developer, then that money is refundable. It's really kind of a deposit to ensure that large schemes have enough ponds available to service them downstream of the system when they've received their planning permission, sorry. And again, just to emphasize, for every occupied pond lost, we require 4 compensation ponds, and compensation ponds are provided ahead of impact and are monitored and managed for 25 years, our definition of in perpetuity. I'll just talk through this. So I said before that we require survey information or no survey. Sorry, we don't require survey information. We've got an option of either going no survey or survey. When we set up DLL, we assumed that we get very few applications with survey information. We changed the scheme to ensure that we can service both. On many occasions, we were finding ecologists were on site, perhaps for other species. Time constraints were less of an issue, so survey was being undertaken. So we ensured that the model works and the impact assessment works with either. So with no survey information, we use the pond layer, our own pond layer from master map. We layer that over the top of the red line boundary. And for sites where newts are likely to be present, deemed as amber zones, we require 2 compensation ponds for those. For sites in green zones, it's 1-to-1, because we are wedded to seeing no net loss of ponds. However, where survey information is available, and if it is available, we do require it. We do ask for it to be presented to us. For every occupied pond, we require 4 compensation ponds. For ponds with an absence of GCM, we require 1. And for ponds not accessed, we require 2. When I say not accessed, that might be health and safety reasons within the red line boundary, or more particularly, we look at neighbouring ponds, as I said earlier, and landowners may not give them permission. So 2 ponds for those. Just to highlight, the occupancy of ponds varies enormously. And as I mentioned earlier, Lancashire, 12.4% of ponds are occupied. In Essex, it's 46.8% of ponds are occupied by GCM. So it varies widely. But these compensation ratios work and will deliver at least 4-to-1 for any area of the country. Only if the compensation ratio goes above 50% would we have to adjust the models that we work to. We do consider all ponds within the red line boundary to be lost, functionally lost to the species, whether they remain post-development or not. And we do, as mentioned earlier, consider the terrestrial habitat lost for those ponds within 250 metres of the boundary of a red line boundary. So in the buffer zone. So those ponds clearly will be still present post-development. We will look at the proportion of them. And we do that, that's impacted, and we do that by drawing a 250 metre boundary around that pond and seeing the percentage of the pond within the boundary of the development. So in this case, the yellow area, the shaded yellow area of that pond, and so roughly a third of that pond will be impacted, maybe 25% of that pond will be impacted by that development. So you'll look at 25% of that pond. So it'd be a 0.25 multiplier. And that's how we determine the number of ponds impacted. We have reviewed the costs of delivering habitat and the cost to DLL for a developer over the last 12 months, and they've been subtly adjusted. So every compensation pond costs a developer £15,850 plus VAT. We have actually brought the inquiry fee down, and each license costs £690. And so we judge the number of compensation ponds required, and we times that by 15,850. And of course, it can be, rarely is it whole ponds, it's generally fractions of ponds because of accounting for terrestrial habitat and the impact of ponds off-site. So it's derivations thereof. 68% of the money secured is spent on habitat delivery, 17% on monitoring, and only 15% on administration. So DLL is designed to focus the monies towards habitat delivery and monitoring and the future management of those ponds so they remain suitable for the species for the full 25 years. We're confident that those figures work, certainly for the next 2 years. We review these figures every 2 years to ensure that enough monies are being paid up front by the developer to secure A1 habitat for GCM for the full 25 years. I'll now pass on, if I may, to Alex, who's going to talk you through the various types of development that we're looking at now. To date, the vast majority of developments that have come into the scheme tend to be polygon housing development type initiatives, but because we are so convinced that DLL provides better outcomes for the species, we're looking at ensuring that we can bring in other sorts of developments as well into DLL, and phased developments are one such. So if I may, Alex, I'll pass on to you.
Thanks, Craig. Can you hear me all right?
I can.
Excellent. Okay, so I've got 2 different examples here. So this first one is sort of recognizing that development, large development, can happen over a very long time, and obviously our standard approach is to invoice for the conservation payment at the point of license, or with a first stage payment as well, as Craig described. So recognizing that development can take a long time, and it can be phased in such a way, we're looking now to split that conservation payment in accordance with those phasing, which helps with the budgeting for the developer. So this option's available if there are clear phases, and we would only invoice for that first phase, and we would only license that as well. And once we've sort of designated the timescales, we can build that into the certificate that we issue, and agree that future phases we will invoice for separately down the line, and the license would be extended to cover those phases in due course. And just to note that the license, because we are still bound by the habitat regulation law, that licenses that have killing and injury can't last for longer than 2 years, we would still be sort of rolling that license on while this is happening, to ensure coverage of that site with the ongoing works. And this second example, we're aware that development sites can often be split into quite a few multiple parcels, beyond even the phasing plan, and those parcels can be sold off to different developers in bundles. Potentially, a developer might purchase a number of parcels. It's relative to housing density, I understand. So obviously, from a licensing perspective, this can be quite difficult with DLL, especially where we're looking to resolve licensing issues upstream of planning. So in these situations, we've really encouraged the landholder, who often holds the entire red line boundary in their control, but is planning to sell off these parcels, to we encourage them to obtain the DLL license and pay up front as normal for the whole site, with the intention of them cost recovering that by selling off these plots to developers, and they can market the fact that DLL is covering the whole site, and they don't need to worry about GCN. So there's no loss of income from them. And then that means that there's just one license covering the whole site. There's not going to be multiple licenses that are potentially going to be complicated for both the developers and Natural England to maintain. And a DLL license is very low risk from a legal perspective, because of the flexibility in the conditions of the license and how DLL works. There's no mitigation or compensation required on site. So the only main way a license could be breached if activities were to occur outside of the license boundary of the site, which the majority of time is the planning red line boundary, and therefore that would be a breach of planning as well. So yeah, we've discussed this with county councils that often are landholders for large development sites, and they are happy with that risk of that low risk of holding a license and progressing as such. So we think that's a really good way of streamlining DLL for large phase sites. Thanks, Craig. The next new methodology we've introduced is accounting for temporary impacts. Obviously, DLL, as you'll probably know, we assume the whole site is lost to GCN, and we're compensating accordingly. We've recognised that a lot of schemes are principally temporary in nature, and we wanted to make the cost more proportional to reflect that. So we've come up with a definition of what we think temporary is. So you can see it's activities no longer than 2 years, though that we can account for a slightly longer period if the activities are going to be very low impact and spread out in nature. Habitat must be restored to its original state or better. A pond can not have more than 50% of its terrestrial habitat impacted at any one time, otherwise we will treat it as permanent loss. And ponds within the red line boundary aren't treated as fully lost anymore, and we would account for proportional habitat because, as you can see on the right, a lot of these temporary schemes are quite linear in nature, and a pond within the red line boundary isn't actually getting impacted significantly in some cases. So if those criteria are met, we can apply a 0.25 multiplier to the costs that we come out with, so effectively quartering them. There will be additional conditions on the license to reflect the definition above. So habitat must be reinstated, and a monitoring visit has to be undertaken to confirm that. And the map that we issue will obviously define areas that are temporarily impacted. And as I'll say, below, the permanent impact can still occur and can be accounted for. So that will separate that on the license. So the what we consider temporary impacts would apply to the following types of schemes. So things like railways, linear pipelines and cabling, solar farms potentially, and habitat management works. And where if you have a project that's outside of that, then we're happy to discuss whether that would the temporary impacts would apply to that. And as I said, permanent impacts, we can recognise that there will always be some permanent impact probably with these schemes, so we can account for that separately, and the standard multipliers would apply to that. So just to demonstrate how this would work on this indicative example, we've got a pipeline scheme coming through that's affecting a number of ponds. They all have newts in for the sake of this example. So pond 1 would normally be treated as fully lost under standard DLL, but as I said, we're looking at that proportional impact instead. It's about 40% of habitat loss, which is all temporary in nature. So the occupancy multiplier of 4 times is essentially cancelled out by the temporary multiplier, so you're left with 0.4 ponds being required to compensate for the impacts on that pond. Pond 2 is actually going to be fully lost. There is some permanent impact happening here, and therefore that's just dealt with under the standard methodology, and 4 compensation ponds are required. And pond 3, although it's within the red line boundary, the habitat around it is being temporarily impacted. Actually, more than 50% is going to be impacted, so temporary impacts approach wouldn't apply to it. And again, the standard methodology would apply, with the exception that we don't treat it as fully lost. We are looking at that proportional impact still. So instead of 4 compensation ponds required, it's the 60% times 4, which comes out to 2.4, so slightly less to reflect the lower impact there. Okay, thanks, Greg. And finally, some very large linear schemes we've been discussing over the last couple of years with DLL. Recognise here that when you get to this scale, mainly the fact that we work to the red line boundary causes costs to be disproportionate really to the impacts that are happening. So we've introduced a discretionary advice approach for us to look at DLL slightly differently for these schemes. So principally the 2 things we look at is using the construction boundary instead of the red line boundary. So on the example to the right, you can see the actual physical works happening, a road scheme, for example, going through the middle, but there's a much wider red line boundary which accounts for potentially mitigation for other species or planting. So the impacts here, these are all being accounted for under DLL under the standard approach. So it's we would use the construction boundary instead when it's justified to do so. And of course, we'll still be proportionally compensating for the impacts of those ponds that are within the wider red line boundary. And the second one is normally we would round up. So if any site fell between the amber and the green zones, we would use that amber multiplier. Obviously, linear schemes potentially go back and forth between these zones. So we would carry out the impact assessment proportionally for each zone and work out the cost. This is obviously a no survey route approach where we're not using if there's no survey information available. White zones, Craig mentioned, areas where we anticipate no impact to GCN. We would also apply if we're looking at the very large linear schemes. And just to note that some linear schemes would also qualify for the temporary impact approach that I've mentioned. So we can look at both sets of deviations in parallel. Thanks, Craig.
Thanks, Alex. Obviously, as many of you will be aware, we've done a series of webinars which are all detailed there and all recorded should you require further information. So really, I just want to throw it open to questions. I hope that all made sense. You're probably not aware, we had a technical meltdown at the beginning there, which was quite distracting, but thankfully we managed to get that sorted out. So hopefully the beginning made sense, but if there's anything else that we can run through again or any other questions, please feel free.
Thanks very much to both of you. We do have questions coming in, so I will have a look at those. So we've got a question from Nick. Can you use the modelling to refine SHI by county? For example, if the soil is particularly acid or the pond is in an area of very high pond occupancy, the HSI scores are adjusted accordingly. This would make it more accurate to decide if newts might be present and affect decisions on licensing.
That's a good question. Yeah, I mean, we look at HSI obviously for the ponds to judge whether ponds are suitable, not with 0.7 and above. Just check, where's that question gone?
Oh, sorry, I clicked answered. So if you click on
right.
the answered tab.
Okay, I've got it again. Thank you. I mean, I guess, Nick, that we're confident that the model is predicting beyond 95% as it stands now. Clearly, it is being refined. HSI for GCN, yeah, it's a good mechanism of judging whether GCN are likely to be present, but we believe that the modelling that we look at is better than taking HSI. Now, clearly, it can be refined. We know that HSI can be improved, which is why we kind of looked at developing a bespoke model rather than just using HSI in isolation to determine whether newts are present or not. We took the decision, as you're probably hinting at, that it's probably not a silver bullet for determining whether GCN are present or not. Obviously, all our modelling information is available and open data. And the more and more work we do in terms of monitoring will also feed in and give us a more accurate representation of what's happening. So hopefully that kind of answers your question.
Thanks very much, Craig. Another question here from Robert. Can it be confirmed that a site with an existing valid planning permission where GCN are subsequently found is also eligible for DLL?
Yes, that is correct. Clearly, when we launch a scheme, we're finding quite a few developments that have gone down traditional mitigation licensing, because that was the only show in town, and some of those want to come across to DLL. So it is something that we can accommodate in the process at varying stages. So yeah, yes is the answer to that.
Perfect, thank you. Another question here from Robert. Can you please give any indication of the typical conservation payment costs difference between schemes with no survey and those with survey? Guidance on this would be very useful to assess if the cost of survey is outweighed by any saving on the compensation payment.
That's a good question. Can you just keep that up so it doesn't disappear, so I can digest it. In theory, Robert, on average, there shouldn't be a difference between the no survey and the survey route. Certainly in terms of the habitat that we deliver. That is obviously on average. GCN are a tricky species in terms of their distributions and predicting the levels of occupancy in any given area. It varies. So when we were looking at doing the modelling and the compensation ratios, we were trying to ensure that we weren't favouring survey over no survey. They both work. Sometimes one will be the cheaper, more cost-effective option than the other. But if we get the balance right, that will be reversed in the next case. So in terms of time, then clearly DLL is the best option. In terms of cost, it's probably going to be more expensive to do survey and undertake survey, but not necessarily so. But certainly in terms of time, it really will depend upon the occupancy that you find if you do undertake a survey. Sometimes it'll be higher than the model suggests, sometimes lower than the model suggests. So it varies. Clearly, we would hope that DLL offers a solution so survey options are not needed. And going down the no survey route doesn't mean that you will be charged for more ponds, because the model is indicative of how many ponds are going to be occupied. So there shouldn't really be a difference, but there will be a significant time difference by going down DLL.
Great, thank you, Craig. Next one here from Nick. If a pond is found by survey to have no great crested newts, no offence will be committed when the pond is destroyed, so no licence is needed for its loss. Can you explain why a payment has to be made for loss of ponds with no newts? There appears to be an assumption that a pond with no newts might get colonised by them in the future, which is not necessarily correct.
Yeah, thank you. That would be correct. That is correct, Nick. If there are several ponds on site and there's not newts in any of them, we wouldn't necessarily expect DLL to be used. However, even where newts are present, not every pond will be occupied. So that's the key thing. So we're looking for 1-for-1 for unoccupied ponds, but the assumption is they're part of a collective where ponds are present, sorry, newts are present in ponds. So, but if you're in an area where there are just no newts, then we wouldn't expect you to go down DLL in the first place. So it's very much a case of where there's a high likelihood of newts being present. So they may not be in that pond, but they may be within the terrestrial habitat surrounding the pond because they're breeding in other ponds nearby. So that's why you have 1-for-1. And it is correct that ponds may be colonised in the future, or they may just have stopped using those ponds as a stepping stone to others, but then come back to them because they are ephemeral in their nature. So it's really a case of 1-for-1 where there are ponds nearby that are occupied. It's not a case of 1-for-1 where there are no newts in that area. So we just simply wouldn't expect DLL to be used. Hopefully that makes sense.
That's great. Thank you, Craig. Question here. Hi, when the development happens, does the licence require ecological supervision to ensure any great crested newts within there are not harmed? Excuse my ignorance.
That's not ignorance at all. That's a very valid question. No. It isn't essential that an ecologist is on site. We do recommend it. Under DLL, the monies are invested in habitat provision rather than on individual animals. That is a better conservation outcome for the species, admittedly not necessarily for the individuals. So under traditional mitigation licensing, an awful lot of money is spent on moving individual animals. Under DLL, that money is directed towards habitat, in effect, to save many more animals. And that's the difference. Because DLL is an option, as opposed to traditional licensing, you have to make sure that DLL is it's a cost saving, but the price parameters that you work to have got to work sometimes for DLL and sometimes for traditional mitigation licensing. It's got to be a balance. If DLL invests money in lots of habitat and moving animals, it becomes too expensive and it's not used. So very much the case of where I and colleagues looked at developing DLL was that to reflect upon the fact that developers have a choice. And so you can't do both. You can recommend that you save individual animals on site and you move them, and we do, particularly where we're closing down ponds or where there's very suitable terrestrial habitat. Ecological clerk of works is recommended, but it's not mandatory, because we're saving time, in particular on newt fencing, in particular, and survey, we're saving that and investing the same proportion of that money into habitat, into ponds. Hopefully that makes sense.
That's great, thank you. Question from Liz. How do Natural England costs compare to nature space?
Thanks, Liz. I'm going to, whatever amendment I need to take on that one. The two are good DLL schemes. They work differently. The costs will vary. It will very much depend upon local circumstance. So that's the cop out. But it's very difficult to compare like with like. So nature space work in a different way to the Natural England scheme. Essentially both, though, are investing in habitat, often off-site, to ensure FCS is met. So that it will vary, just like it does vary whether you survey or no survey with the Natural England scheme.
Brilliant, thank you. Another question from Liz. Is there a disincentive in supplying survey information, as compensation required seems to be more where surveys are available than where they aren't, according to the example shown?
It should make no difference, Liz. If survey information is available, it must be supplied. However, the scheme works equally as well and was actually designed for scenarios where survey information is not available. But the ratios are worked out to ensure that we're delivering the right amount of compensation regardless. And that's why the ratios, the occupancy, occupied ponds, unoccupied ponds, the amber zone, the green zone, all of those are designed so it should make no difference either way. Of course, sometimes you'll have newts present, sometimes you'll predict newts present and they're not. But on balance, working at that landscape scale across a strategy area, it will make no difference. Of course, there'll be odd individual cases where it does make a difference. But until you survey, you wouldn't know. Hopefully that helps.
Brilliant, thank you. James asks, could you also use the construction boundary instead of the RLB for any development, regardless of scale or degree of, I'm not sure on that word, linearity?
Linearity, yeah.
Yeah, that's it. Often the RLB merely reflects land ownership rather than any reflection on where construction will take place or impacts will happen. Okay,
not as a matter of course, James. Amorphous developments, like a polygon, the impact on within the red line boundary will in effect be across the entire red line boundary. However, if there are exceptions where there is a significant land parcel as an adjunct to the development footprint, then we would look at that. So we would discuss that. We probably advise that the customer came through DAS, discretionary advice, and we could account for that and make adjustments. But it's not something that is, we're not looking at development footprints literally to be squeezed around houses to avoid ponds to try and bring the conservation payment down. That wouldn't be right. We will be underestimating the impact on GCN, which to me is the most important thing of all. So, but like I say, sometimes you're right. If if the land parcel and there's suddenly like an offshoot and there's a field over to the right and there's ponds in it, then we would discuss that with you, and we would potentially adjust the impact assessment accordingly. But it would be on a case-by-case basis and isn't something we would do as a matter of course.
Great, thank you, Craig. So a question from Greg. In a TCPA context, the red line boundary has a significance in that it is the area of land in which there will be a development impact of the blue line boundary, which delineates ownership, control, etc. Alex, given the above, I'm wondering how one can justify using the construction boundary rather than red line boundary to determine impact, particularly since such projects are more likely to be more high value works.
Okay, thanks, Greg. That's pulled me up on something I crucially missed, is that, yes, obviously we wouldn't just use the construction boundary if there was evidence that there was more impacts beyond that construction boundary into the red line boundary. We would obviously discuss with the developer and the ecologist and find out exactly where the impacts are happening. So in a lot of cases, it's not just the construction boundary; it's the area that is required to be licensed. You know, if there's impacts, if there are still impacts within the red line boundary that would impact GCN. It would essentially be an amalgamation of both boundaries. We would term it the licensable boundary, which is what, for mitigation licensing is usually the case. You're just licensing those areas where you know are going to have impacts on GCN.
That's great, thank you, Alex. Question here: if a project is for conservation benefit and public good, does the same metric apply?
This is a nice easy one at last. Yes. it
Great,
no
thank
difference.
you. Another one: is biodiversity net gain to be treated separately?
This is kind of yes, but it's nuanced. In effect, the two are separate. Clearly, we are looking at working with BNG to ensure that there's compatibility between the two. It is likely that DLL will take counted by BNG as a neutral position, neither plus or minus. So we are working closely with biodiversity net gain colleagues, in particular because a lot of the thinking around DLL is helping inform the way and the shape of BNG moving forward. But in essence, they are two separate things. But they will account for DLL, but only to take that particular aspect of that development to a neutral position.
Perfect, thank you. Question from Andrew: how will the district level licensing master map and the likely biodiversity increase that is being proposed to become law work together? Will they likely use a similar model device? Okay,
I mean, that's probably talking about biodiversity increase. I'm presuming we're talking about BNG. The model used for DLL is obviously very bespoke to GCN, but again, we're working closely with colleagues to ensure there's compatibility. And as I mentioned earlier on the steering groups, the additional biodiversity benefits of DLL are accounted in other aspects of multifunctional aspects of development and need, green space, etc., in and around development. So there's tangential benefits, but essentially the model that we use and the mapping is bespoke to GCN.
Perfect, thank you. Question here from John: why does the district level licensing not encourage the management or restoration of ponds within a site, or encourage the creation of on-site ponds and terrestrial habitat?
Okay, John, that's a very good question. Quite simply, because there is significant evidence that a lot of terrestrial habitat is unsustainable. Terrestrial habitat and ponds are unsustainable for the species within a red line boundary of a development site moving forward. Now, of course, that's not the case on every occasion by any means. So when we started off, how do you make the decision whether a pond may be sustainable in 25 years' time? It's very difficult to do. I've been involved in traditional mitigation GCM projects in the past where on-site habitat was retained. And I now know, because I've got a particular interest in several of those sites, that 15 years later, the species has died out. We thought we'd done everything right at the time to save the GCN. In fact, we felt really good about ourselves. Those populations are now extinct. That's almost certainly as a result of the footprint of that development, its impact on terrestrial habitat, and in corridors into the wider landscape that GCN needed. So to be extremely cautious and precautionary, we decided to count every pond on site as functionally lost. Now we know that relatively few of those ponds are actually lost. They are still retained under planning conditions, need for green space, etc. But we count them as functionally lost to the species. Now, if they are retained, that's a win-win. Some of those ponds will be sustainable for GCM potentially in the medium to long term, but there's no way of knowing that. So by being precautionary, assuming all are functionally lost, then we will end up with more suitable ponds for GCN. Hopefully that helps.
Great, thank you, Craig. Question here, how does Ecologist evidence conduct REWCA 8.1?
Alex, can you help me out on that?
I'll field this one, yep. I'll try and paraphrase a slightly longer written answer on this that I'm happy to share with anyone that wants it. But essentially, the GCN only have part protection under the Wildlife Countryside Act, whereas they have full protection under the Habitat Regulations. We don't issue licenses under the Wildlife and Countryside Act. That's the same whether it's DLL or mitigation licensing. So it's not possible to completely cover yourself under the Wildlife Countryside Act. It's ultimately uncertainty remains, and it's the developer's responsibility of deciding whether it affects their decision to use DLL. But essentially, the two bits of legislation would generally be viewed together, and as the habitat regulations and DLL, we've assessed that favourable conservation status of that species at a landscape scale is met, then we're obviously confident that that's a positive outcome for GCN. So hopefully that answers your question. But yeah, happy to share something if not.
That's great, thank you, Alex. Another question. So under district level licensing, animals won't be moved, question mark.
It's not mandatory to do so. So if animals are on site, ponds being drained down, there's good terrestrial habitat, we do advise an ecological clerk who works be on site, and those animals are moved to either a corner of the site or up to 2 kilometres away. So we are happy for animals to be moved up to 2 kilometres from a development site, not beyond that, because of the potential to move disease. But it isn't mandatory, but it is recommended. I'll move straight on to the next one, which is basically a similar topic from Robert. Would it be sensible to insist on some trapping to seed ponds created through the project? So again, Robert, the ponds that we are creating or restoring as part of DLL, we are not seeding, you're quite right, with animals. We are looking for natural colonisation. The ponds are being placed in very specific areas of the country in those SOA maps. So the core and the fringe areas. You've put any data suggests only some 30% of occupancy after 1 year. Depends how you define only. I would say that that's a fantastic occupancy figure of, I think it's 34% of ponds in Kent and Essex, Kent and Cheshire were occupied within a year. That, considering the fact that a lot of these ponds, the vegetation will only be establishing, a lot of them are newly created. I think that 34% of ponds being occupied within a year, often less than a year, is a remarkably high figure. We only actually suspected or estimated occupancy within that time frame to be running at 16%, which is actually 34%, which is high. And obviously, as ponds mature and become more suitable, and more animals find those new ponds, then that occupancy rate will rise. But we're not looking at seeding ponds using animals from other sites.
Thanks very much, Craig.
Yeah, I'll go with this one, Christy.
Yeah, go for it. Yeah.
Yeah. Essentially, yes, Andrew, build it, they will come. Yes, that is exactly it. We're building ponds where we know that they won't be impacted by development, where we know there are newts nearby, and they do rock up. Of course, I should say all of these ponds are being monitored for the first 4 years. Years 8, 16, 24. All of the ponds are being managed in years 8, 16, and 24. And clearly, if any occupancy is below expectation, then we will look at why that might be. So, and 11% of ponds are being subject to population survey, as well as just eDNA survey of presence and absence. Thank you. I've done Andrew's one. Does each scheme? No. Essentially, nature space and any schemes don't overlap. So nature space are running schemes in the South Midlands, Northamptonshire, and other areas coming on stream soon. But there isn't an overlap. Sussex will be coming on stream with nature space, not Natural England. So there isn't an overlap. It's generally one or the other. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you, Craig. Something from John. Developers will surely realise that they submit an application boundary that avoids including ponds.
Well, that is something clearly we will be looking out for. And if we're seeing relatively strange lines drawn on a map that they're clearly just missing off ponds, then we pick up on that. So yeah, we do look at each and every application when we're doing the impact assessment and would adjust accordingly. But like I said earlier in another example, if there are areas of land that have just been simply bought as part of a development in another very different part of the site, then we would account for that as well. So we're very mindful of that.
Thank you, Craig. If the developer is putting ponds back in an area of proximity under licensed ecologist supervision, does this affect the payment required to the district level licensing scheme?
Essentially, no, because of the issues about whether ponds will be functional moving forward. So generally, we're looking at ponds being put in areas well away from development. I would caveat that particularly for some forms of development like linear schemes, but it may be advantageous to put ponds quite close to the linear scheme to avoid the impacts on metapopulations. Where metapopulations might be fragmented, there may very well be a justified reason for putting in ponds close to the footprint of that development. And in those cases, that would be accounted for, but that is very much a nuanced conversation. Essentially, we are looking at investing habitat within the SOA areas, which is highly unlikely that the developer will own land in such. But like I say, for some sort of schemes, such as linear developments in particular, it is advantageous on occasions to put ponds nearby. And that may well be done by the developer under supervision by an ecologist. And costs would be reflected.
Great, thank you. Nick asks, the list of people in all those many steering groups included those from various nature conservation organisations and public sector, which is entirely appropriate. I didn't see any developer or consultancy organisations listed. Have you got developers or their representatives on steering groups?
No, not on steering groups, not developers. Ecological consultancies are represented on the expert panel, but the steering groups are entirely focused on delivering the right habitat in the right places, irrespective of development pressure. Clearly, the LPAs are represented, and they provide information up front about likely development pressures moving forward, and hence where we may or may not need to see habitat put in place over the next 12 months or so, but not developers. No, it's entirely conservation-based focus with the input on development coming from the LPA.
Great, thank you. Another question, is there useful work from the preparation of the current position that evidence-best translocation, and when this fails, has the best evidence base been shared for evidence towards biodiversity net gain or any developer translocations which they opt?
Essentially not detailed. The information about what's been happening under traditional mitigation licensing is not as robust as maybe we would all like it to be. There is plenty of evidence of where it has failed. It is very difficult to ascertain why. Far better, I think, to put ponds where newts want to be, rather than create ponds and try and put them in that location, which has maybe been a focus in the past. Which is why, again, going back to the SOAs, we are focusing on putting in ponds where we know newts would like to be. And of course, we've got to reflect upon the fact that there's been a huge pond loss since the 1960s. And that's really the reason that GCN have declined so much. Not through development pressure per se, it's through the loss of particularly farmland ponds within the wider landscape. So it's by putting in those ponds back into that landscape that we're going to actually reverse the fortunes for GCN. And that really is the basis of DLL.
Great, thank you. So Laura asks, is it likely that consideration will be made in future to incorporating the costs of the inquiry fee into the conservation payment, or to publishing a calculator tool so that a client's ecologist can determine costs at the outset?
All right, so very quickly, no, yes. The inquiry fee is required, and it will be separate for the conservation payment, because of course not every developer then enters into DLL, dependent upon the size of the conservation payment due. And the inquiry fee reflects the impact assessment work that has to be done to determine the size of the potential conservation payment. So they do need to be kept separate. However, we are keen and looking at producing a calculator tool to allow ecologists to determine costs as early as possible. And that's something that I and colleagues are working on at the moment. And there is the aspiration in the future to have all this online as a fully online portal to allow such to happen. But before that, I think there will be some sort of, we will be able to produce some sort of calculator to give an indication. It won't be as accurate as an impact assessment, but it will give a flavour for what that conservation payment might be. I'll take this next question. I'll just read this. So, definition of in perpetuity, 25 years. Could development build on these in the future? Hopefully not, Claire. The very idea of SOAs and where they are has been determined through conversation, not only from an ecological perspective, but close conversations with LPAs about where future development may or may not take place. So what we take is the allocation data from an LPA moving forward, and we strip out areas that might otherwise be suitable for GCN that may be subjected to development pressure in the medium future. That's not to say, of course, I can't say what will happen in 50 or 100 years' time, but certainly in the 20, 30, 40 years we're looking at, then it's highly unlikely that any of these sites are going to be subjected to development pressure. So we work very closely to determine that with the LPAs from the very outset. Don't know if you want to try this one, Alex.
Sorry, this is the...
Sorry, the LPA Ecologist interpreting local policies.
I'm afraid that might be beyond my planning expertise. Sorry.
Okay, Claire. If there's anything we can't answer, that can be highlighted. We'll look at that and come back to you, if that's okay. You've defeated us.
I'll do this one though.
Yep.
So yeah, essentially yes. The unlicensed is probably the wrong term. You'd be acting as an authorized individual under that DLO license that the developer holds. But yes, it's as Craig said earlier, it's optional, but you can certainly move. The license allows the movement of newts. It's a licensed action. So yes, you can do that.
Thanks, Alex. I'll take this one from Andrew. Sorry, anonymous one, isn't it now? We're getting confused by the questions moving around. Local plans reflecting corridors. Yes, they do. So that is why the steering groups, we have LPA representation on them. So clearly the pondscape is changing as we're creating so many ponds. So as I mentioned earlier, today we created 999 ponds as of 31st of March. We're estimating to be delivering 1,000 ponds this financial year alone. Moving forward, that will increase to an estimated 1,300 to 1,400 a year. That is making a significant difference to the pondscape right across the country. And all of that information and those pond layers are all supplied to the LPA. So we can work very much with them hand and glove, which is why LPA representation on the steering groups is so important. I'll pick Alison's question. If it is the responsibility of Natural England to ensure that compensation ponds are maintained, that is done through the habitat delivery bodies, because we want the same organisation to have that ongoing relationship with a landowner over the course of the 25 years. So the vast majority of times it will be the same project officer or group of project officers. They do the monitoring and they do the management. And the monitoring information is fed back to the landowner to ensure that the landowner has the buy-in to the project as much as possible. However, of course, there will be circumstances where things change and maybe the landowner refuses access and refuses maintenance of ponds in the future, or indeed land is sold to somebody else. If that is the case, then those ponds have failed. We are creating contingency ponds for every pond. So we are mitigating for 100% of loss of compensation ponds. That money is paid for by the developer up front. And ponds will be lost for several reasons. Failure because maybe initial water quality is not good enough or they're not retaining water, but also for the reasons you're intimating, landowners changing their mind and not supporting the project. We mitigate that potential by simply creating another pond for every one that is required.
Great. If I read the questions out, I'm not sure attendees can see them. So Gareth asked, is district level licensing likely to be covered in low impact schemes at some point in the future?
Yes, that we are looking at, Gareth, and trying to ensure that DLL offers a solution for as many potential developments as possible, or types of development, including low impact schemes. So clearly we focused on the kind of housing development type, and then as Alex talked through, variations thereof, including linear schemes. But there is very much an aspiration to try and ensure that DLL offers a solution to as many types of development pressure as possible. Because from an ecologist perspective, I firmly believe it offers a better solution for the species.
Thank you. I'm aware that we've got a few minutes to go and about 10 questions left, and they keep coming in. Would you like me to carry on?
Yeah, I'm happy to carry on a bit longer. And like I say, if we don't get any questions, if they can be supplied, I'm more than happy to go through them after this meeting and answer them. So I'll answer every question that comes in.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you. So a question from Carol. For a linear scheme with temporary impacts, does the entire scheme have to be included in the district level licence application, or only licence specific areas where a consultant considers there to be a potential impact on great crested newts based on distance of ponds and suitability of terrestrial habitats to be temporarily impacted?
That's a good question. I think we'd look at DLL offering a solution for the whole. The temporary impact, as Alex said, we're not assuming that it will be all temporary impact. It can be a mix and match. However, if the permanent impact exceeds 50%, then the whole will be deemed permanent impact. But temporary impacts, if the temporary impact is 50% or more, then we would look at that mix and match, and we would look at each pond individually within that boundary, within the construction boundary, and adjust accordingly, if that was the case. So it's very much a pond by pond basis throughout the footprint of the development.
Great, thank you. Is the initial inquiry fee fixed at 570 plus VAT, regardless if you have survey data or not?
Yes.
Great, thank you. Do the responses you've very helpfully provided apply equally to nature space provision of the scheme?
First of all, thank you very much for saying they've been helpfully provided. They're different schemes, they work differently, so you can't assume that everything that we've said, we've been very much talking from a natural England perspective. Some of the principles will definitely be the same, but there are differences between the two. So yeah, that's all I can say of that.
Okay, thank you. Please, could you share any evidence regarding impacts to other amphibians as a result of district level licensing?
When we're surveying the ponds and through monitoring, then we are asking our habitat delivery bodies to look at other species, other taxa, and record those, which will include other amphibians. And as we move forward, so monitoring is in its early days, really. This summer, we're going to be monitoring, I think, 640 ponds. Last year, it was 140. And that's simply because of the time lag from starting DLL to monitoring. But yes, we will be looking at other amphibians as part of that.
Great, thank you. Question from John. The district level licensing scheme appears to be aimed at relatively large developments, but can be disproportionately expensive for small-scale developments. Will there be a small project or minimum payment to encourage a DLL approach for small projects that would encourage the benefits to the species that district-level licensing can deliver?
Yeah, that certainly can be the case, John. It will depend, of course, upon pond density in and around developments. It is something that I and colleagues are going to be looking at moving forward, yes, for the very reason I said earlier. We want DLL to be an option for as many types of development, big, small, linear, polygon, as possible. But yes, that's something we are going to look at. It is a sweeping statement and incorrect to say for all small-scale developments, but it will, if there's a small-scale development proximate to a large number of ponds, then your assumption is correct. It could be disproportionately expensive.
Thank you, Craig. Question here, can schemes compensating pond loss through legal agreement of pond provision under CSF in farmland opt to do this once?
No, we're very much looking at DLL in isolation because of the legal complexities around protecting ponds. It's a licensing scheme, and therefore we need surety and consistency in how we deliver that. Of course, we speak to CFF colleagues to try and maximise take-up of DLL ponds within the wider farmland, but the two are separate schemes and need to be so from a legal perspective.
Thank you very much. Does government housing pressure on LPAs recognise the corridors?
It's really the same answer I gave earlier. In terms of we work with the LPAs to ensure that habitat is placed in areas that will be sustainable 25 years and beyond. And we're working with them through the steering groups all the time, as well as having that early conversations. The SOA maps are determined by information provided by the LPAs from the get-go as well.
Thank you. I think the question from Greg relates to that slightly. Thinking about the question regarding potential later development, is there potential for a mechanism to feed back to the LPA so those areas in which compensation ponds are created receive additional protection through local planning policy?
Not a formal protection, but in terms of the development pressures, same answer as I just gave. We're putting ponds in areas where there isn't development pressure in the short to medium term, so they are viable, but not in terms of protection through local planning policy. We're not creating newt reserves. We're putting newts right across the landscape. So it's very much, it's a species that Sir John Lawton had in mind in terms of bigger, better joined up. GCN don't really favour and are suitable for newt reserves. Very much a case of trying to connect the pondscape up as it once was in the 1960s and earlier than that.
Perfect, thank you. I think this might relate to an earlier point, but Alison says, so no penalties such as cost recovery?
I guess this might be to do with if landowners pull out of schemes. I'm trying to guess which question it, such as cost recovery. Landowners are not asked to sign a legally binding agreement, Alison. They are asked to sign an agreement, but it isn't legally binding. And that was something I was particularly keen on. And the reason for that is we want to work with landowners. We need to engage as many landowners as possible because we want to invest money in ponds. We don't want to invest money in legal agreements. We don't want to reduce the number of landowners who are interested in ponds because they want that legal agreement checked by a legal colleague or friend of theirs. Now that will mean that there may be a slightly higher loss rate of ponds as a result of working like that. I would potentially dispute that, because we know that legal agreements and the reality are two different things. You can have sites protected, but that doesn't mean that they're not lost. Rather, we invest the money in putting in a contingency pond to ameliorate and reflect the potential loss of 100% of our ponds. So for every pond we need, we actually put in a spare pond. And by not putting in legal agreements, we are attracting more landowners in the scheme who are interested. And then we work with them through the habitat delivery body, that regular contact through somebody who's continually telling them what's happening to their ponds in terms of the management and the monitoring of that pond, for them to get ownership. So it's ownership through pride rather than legal agreement. We're still mitigating loss of each and every pond.
Great, thanks, Craig. Another question from Andrew. So if the great crested newt is found during works, can an unlicensed individual, for example, an ecal, move the great crested newt to the edge of the scheme, 2 kilometres away, as you mentioned, if a district level licence has been issued for the site?
Do you want to go that one, Alex?
Is this not the same as what I answered before? It looks quite similar. I think the answer is yes again.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you, Alex. A question, interesting that there's some differences in the nature space scheme. Where can we understand these differences better? And can the interpretation be appealed through DAS with Natural England?
Well, they couldn't be appealed. They definitely couldn't be appealed through DAS. We would only enter into a discussion on DAS for schemes that are within a Natural England area. The nature space scheme is different. You'd have to go on their website to go through the nuances of those differences. Clearly, what I've described today is how the Natural England scheme works.
Great, thank you. Just 2 more questions to go and then we'll end the Q&A there. Will partners offer offset or compensation to enhance corridors under the Environment Act?
Not particularly. It's not something that we're looking at doing. We're looking at compensation within the wider landscape, which is generally the private farmed landscape. Some habitat compensation does take place in the likes of country parks in exceptional circumstances, and land within the ownership of the LPA or habitat delivery bodies. But the vast majority is going in that private farmed landscape. And we believe that that's the best way to conserve and enhance the populations of GCN, because we know it's in that landscape that the decline has happened because of the loss of ponds.
Perfect, thank you. And our final kind of question or point from Kim, a slightly morbid question, but do we have an understanding of the estimated loss of great crested newts in numbers, potentially due to district level licensing, when the development takes place from fatalities, if no ecal are present? I don't want to labour the point, but it would be interesting to know. And secondly, if anyone has experienced this, and what are the thoughts of the labourers or workforce at the time, as it's always drummed into construction workers currently that they will go to prison or receive a fine.
Okay, thanks for that. It's a shame we've got a morbid question at the end, but it's certainly a serious one. The answer is if a population on a site is deemed to be of national or international importance, then that site will be designated as a red zone and cannot come into DLL. So in the initial stakeholder conversations we have before a scheme is launched, we ask all the bodies present if and where there are nationally important or internationally important populations of GCN in their area. And we're precautionary as ever and those cannot come into DLL. Where that doesn't happen, then we won't know the number of animals necessarily killed as a result of activities. Of course, even under traditional mitigation licensing, we're only catching up or moving a proportion of the animals, albeit a greater number, because of the trapping and the fencing. We still hope that an ecological clerk of works will be on site to move animals to the corner of the site. And that you can, certainly in terms of a pond being closed down, or as I said earlier, areas that look really suitable terrestrial habitat, then a hand search is definitely recommended. And there are best practice guidelines given to hope that that is maximised. It isn't mandatory.
Great, thank you so much, Craig.
I might have just
that was
there.
a mammoth Q&A session.
That's all right.
But yeah, thank you both for answering all of those. I'm sure it's been really helpful to the attendees listening and still with us.
Yeah, just to reiterate, if there are any other questions that occur to you subsequent to this webinar, then I'm more than happy to take emails and answer them accordingly. So thank you all for listening.
That's great. Thank you, Craig, and thank you to Alex and for everyone joining us today. We have recorded this, so if it's okay with Craig and Alex, we'll share that with everybody today, so you can rewatch at your leisure. And we'll also be sending out a feedback survey, so please do fill that in to help us inform future events. And yeah, just a final thank you to Craig, Alex, and everybody for joining, and take care. Thanks a lot, everybody.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Bye.
Cheers. Bye.